If you've ever charted your net worth year by year, you've probably noticed that the line doesn't grow at a steady rate. Some years it barely moves. Other years it jumps by what feels like an absurd amount given how much you saved. That's not random. Net worth doesn't accumulate linearly for middle-class households, the way most personal finance content frames it. It accumulates in jumps, with long stretches of slow growth between specific moments where the math suddenly speeds up. There are 7 of these moments that account for most of the explosive growth that turns a $200,000 net worth at 45 into a $1,500,000 net worth at 65 for households following a normal path. They're predictable, they have specific triggers, and recognizing them in advance lets you position yourself to maximize the speed at each one, instead of getting blindsided when one passes and you didn't notice. This video walks through all 7, with the math behind each, in the rough order they typically arrive for middle-class American households. I'm Tom. This channel is about real personal finance, the kind that actually works for normal people, instead of the kind that gets you to click on a thumbnail. No motivational fluff, no fantasy returns, no get rich quick. Just what the math actually does over time. If that's what you want, hit subscribe. The reason I'm framing wealth building this way, as discrete tipping points rather than smooth accumulation, is that it matches what actually happens in real households. The graph of typical middle-class net worth from 30 to 65 has visible inflection points, not a smooth exponential curve. Each one corresponds to a structural change in the math, where either the compounding accelerates or the cash flow available for savings suddenly increases. Understanding which inflection point is coming next is how you stop being surprised by the timing of your own wealth journey. Tipping point 1. The first $100,000 crossed. The first tipping point is the one Charlie Munger made famous when he said the first $100,000 is the hardest. The reason it's a tipping point isn't psychological, it's structural. At a 7% real return, a $100,000 portfolio generates about $7,000 a year of growth all by itself. That's roughly $580 a month of wealth being created without you doing anything. For most middle-class households, $580 a month is meaningful. It approaches the level of what a typical earner saves out of their paycheck after taxes and fixed costs. So the moment you cross $100,000, the portfolio starts contributing at a rate comparable to your own monthly saving capacity. You stop being the only one doing the work. Before you cross $100,000, the math is dominated by contributions. Save $5,000 a year, and your balance grows by roughly $5,000 a year, plus a small amount of interest. After $100,000, the math is dominated by compound returns plus contributions, working together. Save the same $5,000 a year, and your balance grows by $12,000 a year, because the portfolio added another $7,000 on its own. The compound component alone jumps by 25% compared to an $80,000 balance, since $100,000 at 7% generates $7,000 versus $5,600. The total net worth growth rate increase is closer to 13%, but the meaningful change is that the portfolio has become a real contributor instead of background noise. For my friend Margaret, the 45-year-old office manager with $80,000 saved I've described on this channel before, crossing $100,000 is about 2 years away at her current pace. That's the first major inflection point in her wealth trajectory. After it, the rate at which her portfolio generates growth on its own jumps meaningfully, even if she changes nothing about her contribution rate. The tipping point is built into the math. Tipping point 2. Compound returns exceed annual contributions. The second tipping point is a more dramatic version of the first. Somewhere between $300,000 and $400,000 of portfolio balance, depending on your contribution rate, compound returns start exceeding annual contributions. At $350,000 invested at a 7% real return, the portfolio generates about $24,500 a year of growth. For a middle-class household contributing the typical 10 to 12% of income to retirement accounts, $24,500 is more than they're putting in from their paycheck. The portfolio is now contributing more to itself than the saver is. This is when the math fundamentally inverts. Up to this point, your behavior has been the primary driver of wealth accumulation. Past this point, your existing balance is. The portfolio becomes the senior partner in the operation, and your contributions become the junior partner. For someone reaching this threshold, the implication is that small changes to lifestyle suddenly matter less than they used to, because the portfolio is doing more of the work than any incremental savings would. And for someone who hasn't reached this threshold yet, the most valuable thing they can do is get there as fast as possible. My friend Jim, a 42-year-old mechanical engineer with about $324,000 in his 401k, is right at the edge of this tipping point. His balance generates about $22,700 a year of compound growth, which is already more than his own $11,400 annual contribution from his 12% savings rate. Even adding his employer match brings his total annual contribution to about $13,800, still less than what the portfolio adds on its own. Within a year or two, the gap widens further. From that point on, the trajectory accelerates, even if his salary stays flat. There's a behavioral consequence to crossing this threshold worth flagging. Households often interpret the rapid growth past this point as evidence that they've become better at investing, when in reality, the math just changed underneath them. The portfolio's outsized growth has nothing to do with skill, market timing, or asset selection. It's pure compounding finally working at scale. Some households make the mistake of attributing the acceleration to their own cleverness, then try to amplify it through riskier strategies that often backfire. The correct mindset is to recognize that you've quietly become a passenger in a vehicle that's now driving itself. And the best thing you can do is stay in your seat and not interfere. Tipping point 3. The mortgage is paid off. The third tipping point is the one most middle-class households underestimate, because it doesn't increase your assets directly. It just frees up enormous cash flow. For a household with a $300,000 mortgage, the monthly principal and interest payment runs around $1,500 to $1,900, depending on the rate that was locked in. Someone who took their mortgage in 2021 at 3% has a P&I around $1,265 a month. A household that took theirs in 2024 at 7% is paying about $1,996 a month. Regardless of the rate, when that payment ends, the entire P&I amount is suddenly cash flow available for any other use, including investing. Take the middle of that range, around $1,900 a month, and redirect it into a broad market index fund for the remaining decade of working years at a 7% real return. That adds about $315,000 to retirement savings. Per Federal Reserve Survey of Consumer Finances data, the median 45 to 54-year-old has somewhere between $87,000 and $115,000 in retirement accounts, depending on the data source. A $315,000 wealth event from a single structural change is larger than that entire median balance, triggered by something the household has been on a 30-year schedule for. Most still let it slip by. The reason most households don't capture this is behavioral. They let the mortgage payoff free up cash flow that gradually expands their lifestyle instead. Per Federal Reserve research on marginal propensity to consume, 65 to 80% of income increases get absorbed into lifestyle within the first year. The mortgage payoff is structurally identical to a $1,900 a month raise, and the same dynamic applies. If you don't pre-commit the redirect before the last mortgage payment clears, the money usually disappears. Tipping point 4. The kids launch from college. The fourth tipping point is similar to the mortgage payoff in structure, but typically more concentrated. Households supporting children through college spend, per College Board data for the 2024-25 academic year, an average of $11,610 a year in tuition and fees alone at in-state public four-year institutions. Adding room and board brings the total cost of attendance for that scenario to roughly $29,910 a year per kid. For private nonprofit institutions, the total cost of attendance averages about $62,990 per kid per year. So for a household with 2 kids in college simultaneously at in-state public schools, the annual expense load runs around $60,000. With private schools, it can run $125,000 or more. When that period ends, typically over a 2 to 4 year window as kids graduate and become financially independent, the household experiences something like a massive raise. If $30,000 a year of post-tax expense load disappears, that's the take-home equivalent of about $40,000 of pre-tax income returning to the household. Redirected into retirement accounts and grown for the decade or so before retirement at a 7% real return, that's another $400,000 of added wealth. For households with 2 simultaneous kids in college, the post-launch period is often the single largest wealth-building window of their working lives. Margaret, who has 2 kids in college right now, is in the middle of this expense peak. Her post-launch window starts in roughly 2 to 3 years. If she steps up her monthly contribution from $400 to $1,000 once her kids are launched, her portfolio at 65 grows from $507,000 to about $728,000. That's $221,000 of additional wealth from a single life transition, captured by a single decision to redirect freed up cash flow rather than let it absorb into lifestyle. Tipping point 5. Catch-up contributions unlock at 50. The fifth tipping point is mechanical and easy to miss because it happens quietly through tax law rather than through a life event. The IRS allows additional retirement contributions starting in the year you turn 50, on top of the standard annual limits. For 2026, the standard 401k limit is $24,500 per worker. At age 50 and over, you can contribute an additional $7,500 of catch-up, bringing the total to $32,500 a year. The Roth IRA allows an additional $1,100 of catch-up on top of the $7,500 standard limit, bringing that account total to $8,600. And per Secure 2.0 provisions taking effect, workers aged 60 to 63 can contribute a super catch-up of $11,250 on top of the standard limit, bringing 401k total to $35,750 for that 4-year window. The implication for someone reaching 50 is that the total annual tax-advantaged retirement savings capacity jumps by $8,600 a year, just from existing rules they're now eligible for. If they were previously maxing the standard 401k and Roth IRA combination at $32,000 a year, they can now contribute $41,100 a year, an increase of 28%. Over the 17 years from 50 to 67, the extra $8,600 a year, compounded at 7% real return, adds about $265,000 to retirement savings. That's a wealth event triggered by nothing more than a calendar birthday. The 4-year super catch-up window from 60 to 63 adds another $11,250 a year of capacity on top of the standard catch-up. That's roughly $50,000 in tax-advantaged savings over the 4-year window, which itself compounds to about $65,000 in retirement value by age 67. Most households don't fully utilize the catch-up provisions because they didn't realize how much capacity was unlocked the moment they crossed 50. One nuance for high earners. Per Secure 2.0 rules, workers earning over $150,000 in FICA wages in the prior year must make their catch-up contributions as Roth, after tax, rather than pre-tax. This affects how the contributions get taxed, but doesn't reduce the dollar capacity itself. Tipping point 6. Career peak earnings window. The sixth tipping point is the period when most middle-class workers hit their lifetime peak earnings. Per Bureau of Labor Statistics data from the first quarter of 2026, median weekly earnings for full-time wage and salary workers now peak in the 35 to 44 age band at about $1,385 a week, or roughly $72,000 a year. The 45 to 54 band is essentially flat at about $1,377 a week, and earnings begin to decline slightly in the 55 to 64 band to about $1,322 a week. So the peak earnings window for most workers runs from about 35 through the early 50s, with the highest savings rate window often arriving a few years later than peak income itself, because that's when fixed expenses have typically declined. What makes this a tipping point isn't the income level itself. It's that fixed expenses often haven't grown proportionally with the career-long income increase. Someone who started their career at $50,000 in their late 20s and reached $80,000 to $90,000 by their late 40s has seen earnings rise by 60 to 80% over that span, depending on industry. If they're at 50 with the mortgage close to paid off, kids launching, and that 60 to 80% higher income than they started with, they're in the highest savings rate window of their lives. If they recognize the moment and capture it, they can save 25 to 35% of gross income for 10 years, which can transform a $500,000 portfolio at 50 into a $1,300,000 portfolio at 60, even with relatively modest market returns. Most households don't recognize the window. They use the income increase to expand lifestyle instead, locking in higher fixed costs that erode the savings capacity the income would have supported. The math on this is particularly brutal because the peak earnings window is finite. It typically lasts 8 to 12 years before retirement, age discrimination, or career transitions reduce earning power. The household that uses those years to expand lifestyle rather than savings exits the window with the same wealth they entered it with, plus a permanently higher cost base that follows them into retirement. By contrast, the household that recognized the window and saved aggressively exits with a portfolio that fully funds retirement, plus the option to step back from full-time work earlier than they otherwise could. Tipping point 7, Social Security claiming. The seventh tipping point is the one that triggers actual retirement income arriving in the household's bank account. Per Social Security Administration data from the March 2026 monthly snapshot, the average retired worker benefit is about $2,080 a month, or roughly $25,000 a year. For a household with 2 earners qualifying for Social Security at full retirement age, that's $50,000 a year of inflation-adjusted income arriving automatically with no portfolio drawdown required. The wealth equivalent of this stream is enormous. At a 4% withdrawal rate, an individual $25,000 Social Security benefit is equivalent to having $625,000 of additional portfolio. A couple's combined $50,000 stream is equivalent to $1,250,000 of portfolio. So the act of crossing into Social Security eligibility, typically at age 67 for full retirement age, is mathematically equivalent to having a $1,250,000 portfolio drop into your lap overnight. The reason most retirees experience the income arriving and don't recognize it as a tipping point is that it doesn't show up on a brokerage statement. It just shows up as monthly income they were always expecting. But the math is what it is, and the net wealth position of a household receiving Social Security streams is dramatically different from the one immediately before. For Pete, the 51-year-old high school teacher I've described before, his Social Security crossover comes at age 67, 16 years from now. At that point, his expected $2,400 a month benefit, plus his wife's spousal $1,200 a month, combined to $43,000 a year of automatic retirement income. Combined with his portfolio, that's the moment his household transitions from saving for retirement to actually retired, and the wealth math fundamentally changes. How to use the 7 together. The 7 tipping points aren't a sequence to be passively weighted through. They're a map of where the math is going to behave differently, and pre-positioning before each one is how you actually maximize the impact. Where you focus depends on which one is coming next for you. In your 30s or early 40s, the most leverage is on tipping points 1 and 2, getting your portfolio across the $100,000 and $350,000 thresholds as fast as the math allows. Once you're in your late 40s or 50s, attention shifts to tipping points 3, 4, 5, and 6, capturing the cash flow that gets freed up rather than letting lifestyle absorb it. For households nearing or past 60, the most leverage is on tipping point 7, optimizing the Social Security claiming decision to maximize the lifetime stream. The pre-positioning for each tipping point is specific. To accelerate the $100,000 threshold, maximize your contribution rate during the slow accumulation phase. At the $350,000 threshold, keep adding to the portfolio even as it starts contributing meaningfully on its own, because each marginal dollar, amplified by the rising compound rate, is more valuable than it was a few years earlier. Before the mortgage payoff arrives, set up an automatic transfer to your brokerage account at the same monthly amount as the mortgage P&I, scheduled to begin the first day after the final mortgage payment clears. Approaching the kids' launch transition, have a specific dollar amount of contribution increase ready to deploy the month the last child's expenses end. The catch-up provisions at 50 require updating your 401k and Roth IRA contribution amounts the same month you turn 50 to capture the additional capacity immediately. During the career peak earnings window, be honest with yourself about whether you're using the income increase to expand lifestyle or to compress your timeline to financial independence. Approaching Social Security age, the claiming age decision itself has roughly $285,000 of equivalent portfolio impact between claiming at 62 and claiming at 70. The mistake most middle-class households make is treating their financial life as a smooth, undifferentiated journey rather than a series of structural events with specific math attached. The events are predictable. The dollar impact is calculable in advance. The only variable is whether you've prepared yourself to capture what each one offers. Households that have done this preparation typically end up with meaningfully more wealth at 65 than similarly situated households that didn't, often substantially more, not because they earned more or saved more on average, but because they recognized when the math was inflecting and didn't waste the moment. Drop a comment with which tipping point you're closest to right now, or which one you think is the most impactful for your specific situation. I read every comment, and I'll reply to as many as I can. And if you want me to walk through the specific Social Security claiming strategy that maximizes the 7th tipping point, including the math on claiming at 62 versus 67 versus 70, hit subscribe because that's the next video. I'll see you in the next one.